I did such a disservice, I believe, to Holbein last time, presenting so much information about that man. Let me just pick out a few of what seemed to me salient qualities about him, about his art and about him. So here you have an image I didn't show last class from that woodcut series he devised when he was still living in Basel in the early 1520s, on the Dance of Death, the theme that was quite current across Europe, which had suffered from the plague on and off for over a century. About death comes to everybody in all stations of life in the midst of whatever they're doing. So this is death seizing a nobleman. It's not a particularly vivid, or it seems to me emotionally meaningful image, but I think of it in terms of what then Holbein's career becomes. So while he lived in Basel, he did secular decorations and some woodcuts, including for, well, I'll leave those out. But he wasn't particularly a portraitist. He did a few portraits, but not very many. But as work essentially vanished from Basel because of the furor and the total life disruption that the Reformation was bringing there, he left for England because he had that letter of introduction to Sir Thomas More provided by Erasmus to him. So from that point on, once he's in England, at first for just not quite 2 years, then he goes home for a little while, then he comes back and spends the rest of his career until he dies, presumably of the plague. In 1543, he largely worked for the nobility. And he has to have been not only, well, we can see that he's just a marvelous portraitist and a very fine painter, but he has to have been very adroit socially and diplomatically, because he will be have as two major patrons the two competing subsequent leaders and the with government too, Sir Thomas More and then Sir Thomas Cromwell, both of whom will be sacrificed to Henry VIII's ambitions. But somehow Holbein was just able to read the currents of history well enough to know that although Sir Thomas More was his primary patron when he first arrived, when he came back, More was on the outs, and he switched to getting more patronage from Sir Thomas Cromwell. Well, I brought the chalk drawing. There's a little, this is just called lead. They didn't have pencil yet. Probably silver point, maybe some other material, maybe lead. This drawing he did of Sir Thomas More, because I wanted to just spend a moment more on the difference between that and the painted portrait, and the kind of necessity or the portraitist's obligation to do more than just render what someone looks like, but also to communicate whatever aspect of the patron's character that patron wants emphasized. So here you have the sense of presumably what the man really looked like. And then in that wonderful portrait in the Frick, which would have been based on this, busy people did not sit for hours for their portraits. They just expected to be sketched maybe in a couple of hours, and then that was it. I did say last time, the one thing you can notice is that here he's made to look older, which is adds to the sort of the dignity befitting his stature in society. But I was looking particularly at what he does to the eyes. He sort of tilts the head down a little and then turns the eyes up. Here, the guy, Moore, is just staring off into space patiently while Holbein is drawing him. But here, now, you have the seriousness of his character, the weight of his responsibilities, the inward-looking profundity of his character being brought out by just that change, adding more shadow in here, turning the eyes up, and then the slight tilt in the head. And for the quality of his renditions that would appeal to people no matter whether they liked what was being done in terms of the way he portrayed them or not, that you could see in this one detail from that wonderful The Ambassadors he did after his second trip to his return to England. These two Frenchmen who were ambassadors in the court of Henry VIII. This man, undoubtedly responsible for all of the paraphernalia in here, including even the skull. So the kind of learned commentary in here about the political situation and his role. But here, it's not only textures, the light absorption, but also the quality of the character, the keen-eyed look of this fellow here. So he had the technical chops and the psychological acumen. And just as an example, I did not show you last time, was this one of the many drawings he did. Sometimes it's known that there's still a surviving painted portrait for it. Sometimes we don't have the painted portrait, but this would be, you can see he just need to capture this head of this baron. And for costume, maybe he was just shown in his night shift here. That would be left to, the costume could be presented to Holbein or to his workshop, and then they could do that. But for this direct gaze and wispy beard, and you have the sense that this man, if he came to your door, you'd know exactly that that's who it was. He does this on for convenience sake, on a paper that he prepared in advance. He made it kind of a pink paper so that you automatically got a kind of flesh tone on it. But that quality of immediacy, you see, that was more acceptable in the numerous portraits he did of merchants and noblemen, but not within the royal family, because they're, as befitted their stature, they had to look above and beyond most of humanity. And sometimes it is that we don't know if we have exactly the original by Holbein or not, because professionally done portraits by the king's painter would then be imitated not only by his workshop, but by many other workshops. I know, for example, for portraits of Henry VIII, people, to flatter Henry, would themselves order that copies of his famous portraits be made so that they would have them. So they just proliferated all over the place. It makes me think of the US presidential custom. I don't know if this still goes on, that when a person reaches 90, you get a signed photograph of the president. It's the way you get your image out there. But here we have again the Anne of Cleves. And I did mention the anecdote related to this. And this is where perhaps Holbein's skill as a painter did not do him well. because Henry had never met Anne of Cleves, it was Sir Thomas Cromwell who had been encouraging that this would be a very good match. So Henry didn't meet her until the wedding day. And when he saw her, evidently he was appalled. He had dispatched Holbein to do a portrait of her, and we think, if this is not the original, anyway, this is the image that Holbein presented of her. It made her so much more attractive than Henry found her to be, that he soon eliminated her as a wife. And then I slipped in the other fact that after this, Henry never commissioned Holbein to make another painting. So there were political dangers, lifelong career dangers to falling out with your chief patron. I did want to show you one more, though, of Anne of Cleves, show you how versatile and the variety of things he did. This is tiny. It's about 1.5 inches. It's a miniature on paper. It's then been glued into, I didn't bring in the opposite side of this. It's ivory that's carved, and on the back, it's an opened Tudor rose. So we know he did miniatures, and they would be another kind of keepsake for people. All right, well, we will go on into, possibly today, we'll manage to cover leap 4 centuries before the day is over. But we are certainly moving into the modern world. Now, you may not look at a birth date at 1774 and death at 1840 and say that's the modern world, but it was, by that time, a shift away from the absolute dominance by the monarchs and growth of cities and the beginning of the development of industrialization and urbanization and a middle class, and the collapse of former forms of authority. Now, this artist, Caspar David Friedrich, his career will go up and down, and I'll show you some about it. He's the only person I'm bringing in as a representative of one of the important movements in early modern German art, which was German Romanticism, far more significant in music than in painting. But Friedrich's career exemplifies it. Here's his self-portrait, just a chalk drawing of him. I think the one thing you would get right away, that he's emphasizing the intensity of his stare. He's demanding engagement, even as it's just engaging with himself in the mirror. So there's a heightened emotional quality. Oh, well, no, we missed one. And let me tell you a little about him. He came from kind of a humble background from a town on the Baltic coast. So we're shifting everything today. We're primarily is now northern Germany or emanating from northern Germany. And he did go to art school. When he settled down in his career, he moved south to Dresden. But he's known primarily for doing fairly small paintings, largely of landscapes, and landscapes of a certain kind. This is a portrait of him made by a friend of his, showing Friedrich in his studio. And it also sort of carries the content of a statement made by Friedrich that's always attached to him, that an artist must not only paint what he sees before him, but also what he sees within him. So there's the romanticism in it. It's not, of course, hearts and flower romance, but it's the self-searching, the interest in the emotional and sentimental part of life, a much more subjective quality. And the way the friend communicates that here, we don't know how true this would be. Certainly, this is Friedrich's studio. He had when he moved in Dresden, he had a studio that's right over the Elbe River. So there was a lot of boat traffic outside, but you don't see any of the outside world here except clouds. He masks all that from view. And what do we see? We see him looking intently at his painting. We have no idea what's on the painting. He doesn't even seem to be actively painting, because although he has the easel and a brush and that maul stick, the way he would prop his arm up as he's painting, this might be a jar of linseed oil. But there's nothing else in this studio. There are no sketches, no props, no unfinished paintings, nothing. So it's all about his communing with whatever is there. Now, this is one by Friedrich, and it's one of his uncommon images of a large-scale image of a person. This is his wife in that same studio. Now the shutters are opened. And it's just called Woman at the Window. It's a wonderfully austere painting itself. Very rectangular here. You notice he doesn't make it boring, because he doesn't make it so we're looking right from the center. I mean, we're not posed right on that floorboard there. It's a little bit off to the side, so we can't see this side wall the way we can here. Now I have a close-up, we'll see here. There may be more jars of that linseed oil over here. And she's leaning forward. You can see a little bit the trees on the other riverbank, and there's some boat going by. I don't know if this would be called a boat or a ship, but there's the mast, adding to all the rectangles in this composition. But even more, what could she be thinking? That's what you're drawn into. I think from her pose, there's just slightly bent forward and slightly to the side. It's not, but not with leaning forward urgently as if she's like peering out to see what's going on out there, but she's just looking forward. You don't so much even have that desire to know, what does her face look like? It's like, what's she doing? What's she thinking? So they were married, they had 3 children. Friedrich had some successes in his early career, and I'll show you that. He did continue to do the same sort of painting, which seemed to just come out of him, essentially was congenial to him, even when the style in art changed. And he himself became more and more reclusive. His friends said he was the most solitary of all solitary people. So he was pretty obdurate, just doing what he did. And that meant that he was not selling very much. And by the end of his life, he was living in obscurity and poverty. He had a couple of strokes, and he had to stop painting, and he then just was still producing images, but mainly in watercolors and drawings. So he was largely a forgotten man by the time he died in 1840. But then there was an exhibition in Berlin around the very beginning of the 20th century on German art from 1775 to 1875. And there were a whole slew of his paintings in there. The great renewed interest in his work. Well, that lapsed again, because he was an artist most admired by Hitler. And Hitler claimed he was a favorite of all German artists. And Hitler used Friedrich's paintings sort of as models for that theme of the blood and soil of Germany, saying that this is truly German, and he shows truly German scenes. So with the fall of the Nazis, as you might imagine, people just wouldn't touch a Friedrich painting with a barge pole. And then there was a revival again in 1975, and I'll come to a painting that explains why that is so. And now he is very popular. As you would see, this is a museum in Berlin that has a large collection of his works. When you see people clustering before two paintings that really established him, and we'll look at each of them in some detail. But if even in the museum, people feel compelled to get that close, do you know that means that they also have to have some kind of intimate connection with the image?
Can you mention his name? I came in late.
Caspar David Friedrich, FR, well, it's like the air conditioning, Friedrich.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So this is one of those two paintings, and it's called Abbey in an Oak Forest. It's in 1809. And you saw, well, for him, it's actually kind of a large painting, at 4 feet across. And I believe this is a pretty good color reproduction of it. This and the next one I'll show you were exhibited as a pair in Berlin, and the Crown Prince of Prussia bought them. So that sort of got his career. Well, he'd done some painting before that, but that sort of gave him a fine foundation. So what do we have here? A few gravestones. It looks like an abandoned cemetery. They're at all odd angles. Looks like blasted trees, these oak trees, just barren trees, ancient trees, and a ruined abbey with a few monks going through here, presumably, possibly, for another funeral. Well, you can have the theme there of mortality, and in the still Catholic world here, in Christian world, it would be then the beginning of immortality. It's at a time of dusk, probably, so the light is fading, like life is fading, like these building has faded and is falling apart as the trees are dying. So all in nature is in sympathy with the human action here. It's all an evocation. And this is one of the hallmarks of German Romantic painting, especially landscape painting, that you find human emotion and you find God in nature. Now, we know this ruin was actually a building that's not far from where Friedrich grew up, and he made many sketches there. And the oak trees were considered the German national tree, especially in the north. This painting, that's it. It looks like it has no other meaning. I mean, it's not too hard to tease out what I've done now. However, this is a time when Napoleonic troops had occupied the area of Prussia where this was. And this was painted just a few months before the young Prince Friedrich who bought it. His mother had died, and she had supposedly pleaded with Napoleon to show mercy and compassion toward the Prussian people. So there could be mourning for the fate of Prussia, mourning for the death of the Queen, all hidden under there as well. And this is the companion piece. It's just called A Monk by the Sea. It's not even really clear that that's a monk, but there's one figure. We know that it evidently, I mean, I know because I read it, but people who examine this carefully, the underpainting, originally he had a figure looking directly over to the side, so maybe you'd see the face, but now you have someone looking out to the sea. And this is a radical painting. It's what's there. Nature. The immensity of nature, of the atmosphere, the chilly water of the Baltic, the empty shore, a few waves, a few birds, mists, a few clouds emerging here. And in terms of the presentation of the image, it's also very unusual. I mean, first, to be so apparently empty of content is like shocking, but it doesn't follow the conventions of landscape painting, which go back some centuries. And he's not the only one who did that, but he was one of the very early ones. There's nothing at the side of the paintings to say, okay, this is the view. This is what's chosen for you. And there's nothing to give you an idea how to get from there to there. You can't imagine sort of walking along and in your mind's eye traversing this landscape. Let me tell you what one of his friends said about this, just so you have an idea how at that time this was considered amazing. Since the scene has in its uniformity and boundlessness no foreground but the frame, it is as if one's eyelids had been cut off. Because it's just expands. So this, maybe this is meant to be Friedrich himself, or there was a well-known preacher who would go down to the shore and would issue his sermons out essentially toward the water like that. Now, this is the painting that so much revived Friedrich's reputation in the 20th century, because there was a very fine art historian named Robert Rosenblum, who in 1975 published a book called, well, it was about the roots of modern art in Northern Romantic art, Romantic painting. And what he used as oh dear, I don't know how I managed to always mislay that here. He was making comparison to the abstract expressionists, and especially Rothko, where there are just fading, merging bands of color that go all across the canvas. Now, Rosenblum doesn't make a case that Rothko is looking at Friedrich paintings, but saying, look how modern this is. Now, this is by Turner, who was also a Romantic artist, English Romantic artist, but this would be slightly more typical because there's a little something at the sides and there are also more human figures. So it's a great landscape and an expansive landscape, but humanity is still more present. Another one by Friedrich. This one evidently appears on a lot of book jackets and posters and gets frequently reproduced now. It's called Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. So these are the tops of mountains. There's some sandstone mountains. You can see the distant trees. So this man has climbed up this height. The wind is blowing his hair. The fog there must be some speed to the wind because it seems to be drifting over with some rapidity there. Now, this is the kind of image that appealed to Hitler. This is the Übermensch. This is man dominant over nature, possibly. But again, there's so many, you can read into this what you want. I say, well, this is the romantic view, especially of nature, that there was a desire to evoke terror, the awe of nature, overwhelming nature against which man is a puny and also somewhat apart from the natural world. So they have huge waterfalls, massive mountains, all the most nature at its most grand and grandiose in romantic painting. And this would be a man apart from nature. You see, he's above it, looking down on it. He's not living in it. And just as with that portrait he did of his wife, never saying that's who she was, maybe just using her because she was a convenient model, you have no idea how this man is responding to it. So this is something for which he becomes famous. He does these so-called back figures because you just see them from the back. And there's something else. He can see all of nature. We can't because he's in the way. So in that sense, human beings still dominant in this image. But this is pretty much fits 20th century sense of abstract composition too. Look the way everything leads into him like that. I mean, it's just marvelously put together. Oh, it's so dramatic. There he is. See, the wind is blowing his hair. Just a little bit of the light on his collar. I know costume historians can say exactly, I believe this is not a contemporary clothing. I think he's shown dressed as what would be considered old German costume that was worn by a lot of sort of revolutionary leading young German, essentially college students. This is the cliffs at Rügen. Rügen is an island in the Baltic. And the idea of the size of this is almost 3 feet high. This seems to be a sort of like a souvenir of his honeymoon. Here's his wife. This is himself. This figure also in this old German costume might be his brother. Rügen is famous for these chalk cliffs. And I'm going to show you them and details of these two figures. And then 2 distant boats. So yeah, look, he's gone from having no frame around this sign, and now you have one that's like, almost like you're looking through a, I don't know, a tube, a telescope, something, because you have this completely framed, and then you go in this distant sky, and it blends off into the horizon. Those are the cliffs at Rügen. So for people there, yeah, it'd be pretty dizzying heights up there. And she seems to be pointing to something down below. You know, it's clutching the branch there for security. And he is really perilously close to the edge. What are they looking at? Again, we don't know. This is pretty cheerful for his paintings. Then he did 2 for a patron. This one is just called Moonrise Over the Sea. Among the romantics, there's a real fondness for scenes, especially of moonlight or early dawn, that idea of the transience, the way everything is changing, nothing is fully perceptible. So here you have 2 women and 1 man perched on a rock, looking at these way out to sea and the sparkle on the water. Again, they're silhouetted in the center. Toward the end of his career, he was sort of repeating his composition. This is still early, but this is where they came from. And then this was a panel that was done along with it. It's just called a solitary oak. There's a shepherd down here and this flock of sheep. Over the hill, there's a village. There's the steeple. Another one of these ancient trees. Well, Friedrich made many sketches, as this one, he even says here, he gives the date 1801. This is a man on, looks like muleback, and then he's talking to somebody down here, but it's largely to do the tree. So he's just drawn to these kind of trees. Or let me give you one other. This is in the Morgan Library. Here's the more thorough landscape drawing he did. Now he does have pencil. So he makes many, many sketches. And in his paintings, so these are the rocks from the quarry. His paintings are never of any scene that he has sketched. His sketches he then brings together into imaginary ideal landscapes. So you have this mountain vastness and these great fields. That could be like, you could even say Bruegel did things like that. But it has, because of this intense realism in the details, you think, oh, this must be a real scene. But no, this isn't. Two men in the moonlight. Again, these wonderful trees. He did 3 versions of this. It's thought that this is probably his own himself and one of his sort of young disciples who died after the first version was done, and then he did 2 other versions. And I'll give you a close-up of them. But before I do, I'll tell you who this painting influenced. Samuel Beckett said this image was the genesis of Waiting for Godot, where in both scenes that they end on a moonlit night with men just waiting.
What was the name of this again, Maggie? I'm sorry to interrupt.
It's just 2 men looking at the moon. They're very generic titles for them.
It's almost like kindred spirits. I mean, I'm seeing the Hudson River School in so many of these.
Yes, absolutely.
It's remarkable.
Yeah. The part that's not like the Hudson River School is this always showing you these figures in the back, so that you have that extra like pull of like, what's going on? What are they thinking? So we never get to see. So you're always left with your own imagination and having to fill it in. This might be the last one of the ones I brought in. It's was called the Polar Ice now, but now it's what are you gonna find it called? The Sea of Ice. It's first called an idealized scene of the Arctic Sea with a wrecked ship on a heaped mass of ice. Well, William Edward Perry was in the 1820s, was beginning to make those polar expeditions when they're trying to find a Northwest Passage. And one of his ships founded in the ice and went down. But this is not meant to be an exact rendition of that. But you see, here's the ship. Being ground into nothingness by these slabs, like granite slabs. And then the lovely, look how cold and clear the air is with those clouds there, and how far away you can see these icebergs floating by. So you can be thinking about the futility of human endeavor, the catastrophe of life lost when there's no one there. No way to recognize or to recover the bodies. And so now it's the ice, not the man who takes the middle of the picture. So they're quite splendid. Oh, no, I did have one more because this is too much. It's called, well, the title of the painting isn't particularly important, but it's Rocky Ravine and Sandstone Mountains. So these same really dramatic settings. And this one, I don't believe, I think there's supposed to be some person in here, but I cannot see it. But look at this. See the difference?
What did you do there, Maggie?
I switched from one image to the next.
Oh.
Because this is a composite of photographs.
Oh.
There's a Japanese artist named Hiroyuki Masuyama, who has made recreations of Turner's paintings and Friedrich's paintings. And he's lived in Germany for himself for a long time. And what he has done is to go around to all the sites where Friedrich had been and made photographs of the spots that are in Friedrich's drawings. And then he's seen the way Friedrich has used them in his paintings. He has made sure to take those photographs when the weather conditions and the lighting conditions as they were when then Friedrich put them in the painting. So then he comes back on his computer and takes, he said it's like 300 to 500 photographs and puts them together in the same way that Friedrich would have taken multiple drawings and putting them together to create the final painting. So he said,
No, that's very unusual.
190 years later, different technology, same process, basically. Except this is now thoroughly derivative, unfortunately, which is, I mean, it's all based on someone else's work. Whereas this was his original compilation.
Oh.
But isn't that amazing?
Is there many people that do this type of a process?
No, but I know there are some other artists who are making, who are very deliberately making things off Friedrich's work. I can't tell you who they are now because I don't know, but I know there are others.
And they're not infringing on copyright.
No.
Interesting.
Yeah, I thought so.
Totally different feeling.
Mm-hmm. Then he shows it against a light glass. So it'll have a different kind of luminosity. Plus, you never know what the quality of a reproduction is. So maybe this is more luminous if we were to see it in the reality rather than, we need to go to Berlin and then we can see it.
Oh,
well,
there a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah, we are really changing. So now we get to modern art. That was 19th century art just there. Now we see we are getting these 400 years. So Kirchner is a leader in German expressionist art. There are two groups. It's right at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's one of the first really modern movements in German painting. It's expressionism in German music and German literature, just as there was German Romantic painting and German Romantic authors long before Friedrich was on the scene. But Kirchner, I think, is very influential now. I'll just give you a photograph of him that he took himself. say a little about him. He started out as he went to school in Dresden. He was going to be an architect, but even his first year in school, he made a good friend. And they decided to become painters. And they definitely wanted painting that was, or they wanted to express what modernity meant to them. They were drawn to cities. They disliked bourgeois-like life. They wanted to turn away from the past, to overturn the past. Let me see if I can have something. Yes, here's something he wrote. We call all young people together as a young people who carry the future in us. We want to wrest our freedom for our actions and our lives from the older, comfortably established forces. And I think during the climate crisis, when the young want us to be wrested away from our older, comfortable ways, it really does resonate. So he was a painter. He did also some photography. He did some sculpture. He had a difficult and ultimately tragic life. He suffered from various kinds of addictions. He sort of, I just hate this. He fits the stereotype of the modern misfit artist, you know, the creative genius who can't get along in society. I mean, he was addicted to several kinds of drugs. He was an alcoholic. He had, he enlisted in the field artillery in World War I, but he had a complete breakdown before he could ever get, and he was demobbed. He was out before he even got to the front lines. He continued to paint. He always had very good friends, but ultimately his work was seized by Hitler, and it was shown in that degenerate art show. And as a consequence for that, within a year, he took his own life. So against that backdrop, we'll look at some things by him. I don't know if you're going to say this is a palette cleanser. It's quite different, isn't it? This is just called the Tightrope Walk. It's from 1908 to 1910. This is modernity at its most. He started out in Dresden, and Dresden was a very active art scene, and there were a lot of exhibitions of art coming from France. France at that time certainly had supplanted Italy as the seedbed of all that was new. So he was aware of what was the most current art in Paris, and then there would be periodicals and there would be reviews, so he could keep up with it as well. And you can see he and the half a dozen artists who joined with him in a collective called The Brook, which means the bridge, how they embrace that. So to see what he does, compare it to several Parisian works. What you have here anyway are two women on a tightrope. It's a little bit hard to place where the rest of this is. Presumably these forms appear, that's suggesting the radiating light from spotlights. But tightrope walkers terrified and thrilled people because they're daring nature, daring gravity. And this was the kind of popular entertainment in the big cities now. And Kirchner, as a young man, often frequented cabarets and circuses, where he could see the non-bourgeois life. The thought was that circus performers lived outside the norms. They didn't obey the sexual, emotional, physical standards of the way life ought to be in conventional German society. And that's what he longed for, to break through. And there's another, this is a little bit more theoretical. We'll get through this. there's explanation. So he's in this group called The Bridge. There's another expressionist group in Munich called the Blue Rider. And if in the next series I talk about Russian art, that's a group to which Kandinsky belonged, and I'll talk about them then. But they also were seeking this kind of like extremely emotional, frenzied, passionate, spontaneous, new, simultaneously new and very primitive art. Well, one of the sources that was source of sustenance, sort of like emotional sustenance for the Bridge group, was Nietzsche's writing. And because Nietzsche, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, said, this is in the prologue to it, he says, man is a rope over an abyss, a dangerous going across. So it's about the very precariousness of life. And the rope going across is going across from the past to the future. And that's the meaning that they took for the bridge. It's seeing the world that's to come. So think of Toulouse-Lautrec, 1890s, that interest in cabaret life, but and artificial lighting here. But in terms of the means of painting, no. Subject matter, yes. This is also with Morgan. This is one of Kirchner's drawing of figures on a tightrope. Yes. So the subject matter is not new, but now it's given a sort of like a philosophical or psychological meaning. So all these young people are drawn to the cities. Well, that's a standard story, right? And so among the, here's another one of the entertainments he liked. This one is called Panama Dancers. It was a troupe from America of Blacks. And they were very popular entertainment because they were seen as primitive. That was another way of escaping the strictures of Western life. And here they're called the Panama Dancers because it's the time of the creation of the Panama Canal. So it was just a popular name. But the dance they're dancing is the cakewalk. The greenish light here is to also suggest like floodlights. Here's another one by Kirchner. This is called A Street in Dresden in 1908. This is a quite well-known one for us because it's in the Museum of Modern Art. It's big, it's about 6 feet across. So these are scenes that you have to look at. And what an assertion. It's an assertion of painting. This is maybe a figure, but you see mainly big, thick strokes of green paint and blue paint and red paint and electric colors and dissonant colors. Look at the colors of the flesh, how that switches here. This is a child with his hat. And you don't get to see the city. He's largely looking at the people. Just a few faces stand out. And it's such a peculiar composition, isn't it? People are pushed off to the sides. So it doesn't follow any of the rules. No balance, no order. plunging perspective. You don't even get to see far back. This is a trolley or something back here. Just that row of heads cuts it off. These women with plumed hats, many of them would be like this one here. That was the costume of prostitutes. So it's life on the city streets. Now, there's another source of inspiration here. It's not just the life itself that he's trying to show in new and raw and immediate ways, but he's also, well, yeah, look at this one. That's by Munch, from about, Edvard Munch is about 20 years older than him. He'd seen Munch's work. Munch is Norwegian. This is called The Dance of Life, and it's around 1900. But you see the same kind of vivid, intense, non-natural color and the wavering, curving outlines. The style is fairly similar to what then Kirchner will develop. And that off-angle composition, oh, this is one of the French Impressionists. So he's pulling in and making his own all of these novelties. Because this search is, across Europe, and to a lesser extent, American artists essentially working in Europe, finding some way to express what is modern, what is new, how can we be free from what the past was? This is Kirchner again. This is the Berlin street scene from 1913, and this is in the Neue Gallery. This is one that was, I hope I'm correct on this, I believe it is, that this is one that was taken by the Nazis, and then the original owner was able to get it. It was in the Degenerate Art Show. The original owner was able to get it back, and then member of that family, and put it on the market, and then the Neue Gallery more recently has bought it. These would be so-called cocottes. These are prostitutes, and these are possibly their Johns or just passersby. Again, congested. Look at the way the paint, it's almost like feathering strokes of paint, just dash, dash, dash. And the sort of malevolent faces, which are a little bit like masks. He knows Picasso. Here you have a figure from the back. Well, look at who stops. He doesn't even have a lower body down there. So it's the sense is that this is coming out of him in an emotional rush. He just paints it as rapidly as possible. And it's a deliberate attempt to show those brush strokes, that the actual fervor of creating the painting. This will be my last image. I have more for you next time from him. He also did woodcuts. This is another 5 of those cocottes. He did a whole series of these so-called street scenes. And do you know who he's trying to revive, or what he's looking back at now and modernizing is Dürer. Well aware of Dürer's heritage, starting in woodcuts, that he's now modernizing that by making it primitive. Well, that's where we're going to start next time. I have just a couple more by him that I want you to see. Look at this one. And then we will, I don't need to show you all the wares before we get to it. Then we're going to look at some of the art done between World War I and World War II. And I hope get a couple of Kiefers in at the end. So time is up, and questions, of course, I will take.
Maggie,
Yes.
the Friedrich that you showed in the very beginning where he has that long stick. When he just decided to have that long stick, I mean, obviously you could paint with it, but
Oh,
he
no,
could,
no, it's called a sort of like a painting stick. It's to when you have your arm up all the time like this painting and painting carefully, is to rest your arm. You put that under here. You hold it with the other hand. So it's to hold your arm up.
it just didn't even look like it looked like it would hit the wall. He wouldn't even be
Yeah,
able
I
to
know,
do
I know, it's way too long. Yeah.
Maggie, do you know if Friedrich did not feel good about painting faces, that he always painted the back?
I think it's fully possible that he just maybe was not good at them. I don't know. Because I mean, it's such a marvelous device what he does. I mean,
right.
it pulls you in.
There's no write-up or evidence of.
No, that I know. Because when I think of the few drawings I've seen that he's done of people, oh, darn, they're from the back too. Anyone else?
I liked most of those paintings, the ones with the backs to us.
Uh-huh.
Beautiful scenery.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, he's very popular now. Yeah. They somehow, I don't know if they soothe something for us. Yeah, they're very,
Well,
very
it's food for thought. It just makes you wonder more about it.
Mhm. And it also, those first ones, when you saw the people in the Berlin in the museum, you know, hovering and getting as close as possible. Most of the paintings are quite small. So also, you have that intimate connection with them. You need to get close, and then you think of what was in, and you look at it closely. You know, they're very pressing on you that way.
Maggie, was Kirchner friends with Picasso?
No, he wouldn't have known him at all. I don't, but
For some of his
Picasso-
such strong.
oh yeah, and I'll show an another example. Because yes, because there was such a, by this time, a sort of like a trade in art magazines and art criticism, and also some works. And you really need to check which early works by Picasso were shipped out. So they did have access, so they saw these things. Early works by Picasso shipped out. In reproduction, they saw them, if not in reality. Any more? Okay.